Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. Can I ask everyone in the room please to ensure that phones are off or on silent? While it is acceptable to use mobile devices for social media within the room, please do not take photographs or record proceedings. The first item on the agenda is to take evidence as part of the committee's inquiry on the supply and demand for medicine. And we will take evidence on dispensing this morning. And can I welcome to the committee Professor Angela Timoni, the Director of Pharmacy at NHS Lothian, Gail Caldwell, Director of Pharmacy, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Campbell Shimmons, Community Pharmacist from Forth Valley and from Community Pharmacy Scotland, and welcome back Jonathan Burton, Chair of the Scottish Pharmacy Board of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in Scotland. Welcome to you all, and can I start by I know some of you have been in the room and even on the panel for previous discussions. Can I ask, first of all, around medicines waste, because that's one of the issues that has come up recurrently. Perhaps start and ask Gail Caldwell and Angela Timoni about level and causes of waste in individual health boards, and also what wider lessons we might draw. In other words, what do you know about waste and the causes of it? We know from the big picture there are a number of issues that have been identified: repeat prescribing, over-ordering, and care homes and so on. So I wonder if I could ask you to start with that issue and then widen it out from there.
Okay, thank you very much. So perhaps if I can start talking a little bit, first of all, about waste in relation to, I think, repeat prescribing. So in Scotland, there are systems known as managed repeats, which are systems that are often used in community pharmacy to support patients in the ordering of their medicines. And managed repeat systems are normally where the community pharmacist might take control, with the patient's consent, of ordering their medicines. And we hear in health boards some anecdotal evidence that these systems can lead to increased waste. But when we looked at the data for a managed repeat service within one of the GGC partnerships, what we noticed was that when managed repeats were stopped, then there was actually no change in either the volume or cost of medicines dispensed in that area. And I think what's important to think about is that these systems for supporting patients to manage long-term conditions are really important. They're important because we need to use the skills of the community pharmacists to support them to get the most from their medicines, to check around adherence and concordance with their prescription. But also it's important to manage workload and workflow within the community pharmacy. The committee will have seen in the submission from CPS, for example, there's 100 million items dispensed in community pharmacy. So what boards are moving to do is to support the rollout of the Medicines Care and Review Service and serial prescribing. And I think that doesn't have the same risks as managed repeats because each time the patient presents for the prescription, the pharmacist will check that the patient does require that medicine, and so it actually reduces the amount of times a medicine is dispensed. But also it's important because as part of that service, in order that we can support patients to get the most from their medicines, they will get a medicines review. And that means that any inappropriate polypharmacy can be assessed and obviously changes made. So I think some of the systems around repeat prescribing can, anecdotally, as I've said, suggest that they can generate waste. But I think it's how we manage those going forward with systems like managed care and review, which I think are really important strategies for boards.
Thank you very much. Angela Timoni.
To talk about some other issues then, Gail's covered quite well what they're doing in Glasgow, and we're also doing in Lothian around trying to support community pharmacy. For me, the biggest waste is a medicine that's prescribed for a patient that's expected to have a therapeutic benefit that the patient doesn't take. So I think there's a real issue for us about ensuring that patients understand their medicines and do take their medicines, because a medicine that's prescribed and that actually then just goes into waste is effectively the most expensive medicine we could buy. From the hospital managed service as well, you might want to, we talked a bit about community pharmacy. Within the hospital managed service, we have our processes. We have processes to manage waste and to manage our stock control systems. We have key performance indicators. So our key performance indicator is that we should have less than 0.4% of our medicines in waste. And we have more than met that every year for the past 6 years that I've been Director of Pharmacy in NHS Lothian.
For secondary care, yeah. And I wonder if I can ask Campbell Shimmons or Jonathan Burton about their take on the wider picture, if you like, around medicine wastage and unused medicines.
Thanks, Chair. If I can speak about the ground level, if you like, of community pharmacy practice. Managed repeats was a perceived problem that has been evidence not to actually exist. What we do at the ground level is when a patient's reordering their medicines, we check that they actually need the medicines. We have an opportunity every month, every second month, to question the patient, to interact with the patient, and find out that make sure they check their understanding of why they're taking their medicines, what they're for, and if they're having any problems. And that's an ongoing part of pharmacy practice. But we've brought that under one titled umbrella in the Medicines Care and Review Service, and we're going to include serial prescribing in that, which gives us an even better opportunity through scheduling workload to allow us to spend a bit more time patient-facing and inquire as to the patient's adherence and concordance. And it's something that we've been doing, for the last few years, but it's now been formalised the last couple of years. We're not seeing at the ground level an increase in waste by weight. By value, I don't know, because we don't actually measure the value of the stuff that goes in the box. There's a notional amount attached to the weight of a tablet in a disposal bin, if you like. But we're actually probably seeing less disposal uplifts, which is a good sign, probably the last 2 or 3 years. We find as well that most adherence or concordance problems are to do with patient understanding and education. There's a lot of perceptions around certain medicines, anticoagulants, statins, things like that, which can often be put to bed by some reassurance about the frequency of side effects and what the side effects actually are, if there are any. So at the ground level, I would say that waste is less of a problem, but still a problem. And, as Angela said, a therapeutic prescription that's not been taken is the worst form of waste of all. So there's a huge job there in changing that.
I think if I understood Angela Timoney correctly, 0.4% is the KPI for hospital medicines wasted. Would there be what would be the relevant or comparable figure? I know you can only do it by weight. But
I don't have one for community pharmacy, but there's probably somebody here from primary care that could give the answer from a primary care perspective, but I don't have a KPI for community pharmacy.
Okay. Jonathan?
Yeah, in regards to medicine waste, I just wanted to speak to 2 points that we picked out in our written submission, 2 of our key overarching principles. The first one is the time to care. So, during the course of this inquiry, we've heard about how complex medicines are, how complex people are, and when those 2 things are put together, that's why medicines don't often end up getting taken as they should, or sometimes people end up with the wrong type of medicine. And if pharmacists are going to impact more on that, and I think we do impact on that already, but if we're going to impact more on that, then we need the time to care, the time to have those conversations. So in community practice, that's about creating the time and making sure the contractual framework supports that time to speak to people when they're reordering their medicines, be they opportunistic interventions or planned interventions. And our pharmacist colleagues working in GP practices need time to care for their patients as well. So it's not just about managing the churn of repeat prescribing, and that is a significant workload. They also need the time again, to make those interventions, to sit down and have those really good conversations with patients, to get to know them better, to build the trust, and that's where you can really start making an impact. The second key point, I think, and again, we've gone back to this time and time again, is the IT connectivity. So it's one thing for me to spot an issue in practice, but I am effectively, communications-wise, isolated from the rest of the system. So when I spot something that's not quite right, or if I address an issue, I want to be able to share that back with my GP pharmacist, GP nurse colleague quickly and effectively. I may need their assistance to get that over the line in terms of a solution. So again, we're talking about read-write access to record and the importance of sharing the good work that we do in community pharmacy back with our colleagues in GP practice and making sure that they can communicate with no barriers back to us.
Thanks. We've heard a bit about managing repeat prescriptions. One specific question, where a prescription is delivered to a patient's home, is that repeat prescription managed, and if so, by whom?
Initially speak to that, and at RPS we actually have a professional guidance document around what are loosely termed managed repeats, and that comes in several ways, shapes and forms. I mean, a classic example would be a patient who, for whatever reason, currently has their medication in some form of what we would call a monitored dosage system, or a medicines tray would be another term for that. Now, where you've got, and that brings with it a lot of sort of technicalities around the timing, the time that goes into preparing that, and pharmacies will tend to manage that they'll micromanage that to a certain extent, just to make sure that the prescriptions are processed in time, that the technical task of getting the tray put together is all done in a timely manner. So when patients are getting medicines delivered, some of the time that is being quite tightly controlled between the GP practice and the pharmacy. Other times, the patient will have a delivery for other reasons, and they may actually have quite a lot of control over their ordering. But what our professional guidelines state is that the patient must be involved in these processes in one way or another, dependent on what the particular situation is. And it's very, very important we don't lose sight of that, because again, if we're not having the conversations with the patients, that's when they end up on medicines that they don't need or they don't want.
Thank you. Another scenario where patients may receive medicines delivered to their home is via systems called home care. So that's where a patient may attend an outpatient clinic, and the prescribing and monitoring of that medicine is through that hospital specialist outpatient clinic. But the medicine will be supplied to the patient through a home care arrangement. So it saves the patient having to come back up to the hospital. The medicine can be delivered to the patient's home. Normally when it's a long-term condition, but yet that condition is still being managed through the hospital outpatient. There's been quite a lot of work in NHS Scotland over the last few years to recognise the importance of the governance frameworks around medicines delivered through home care. And sometimes the manufacturers will, when making their medicine available to us, make the home care route the preferred route of supply for that particular medicine.
Okay. Sandra, brief supplementary.
Yeah, and good morning. It was a follow-up on what the convener had actually asked in regard to if the patient isn't able to come to the pharmacy themselves. And you mentioned home care and you mentioned the technology, etc. If someone goes to pick up that patient's prescription, you obviously have a chat with the patient when they're there, but did you have a chat with the relatives or whoever picks it up? Because I feel that is the blockage, basically, because they're just going to pick up the repeat prescription and take it back home again. So do you actually phone the patient up, or do you take cognizance of the fact that this patient hasn't been seen in the pharmacy for a couple of months and it's just somebody that's picking it up? So we don't know if the medicine's suitable or not. So I just wondered, do you take notes of that, or do you, it's something that's...
Can I answer this? Yeah, in community pharmacy, the beauty of it is you're in the heart of a community, you know your patients, it's the same people you see on a regular basis, it's the same pharmacist more often than not, or the same pharmacy team. And it becomes very apparent as patients are transitioning from you know, wellness to illness and being unable to, or becoming more housebound and more dependent on friends, neighbours and family. And we do tend to react to that, and we offer various supportive aids around their medicine, and the ordering and delivery and the management, if you like, of their medicines to accommodate that. If it's a sudden change, like you're mentioning, then certainly in our pharmacies we would contact the patient, but we'd inquire as to the person that was collecting, what the relationship was, you know, how was the patient. So, you know, rest assured, it's one of the first things we'd notice if somebody was by exception, now having somebody else collect their medicines for them. So we would then contact the patient and explore with them what the best solution for them was, bearing in mind what their condition may or may not be. It might be long term, might be acute, you know, might be transient. So yes.
But just, sorry, Chair, just a small follow-up if you don't mind. But the fact that if it isn't changed, the medicine isn't changed and it's consistent, you know, they're coming along once a fortnight, whatever it is, to pick up this medicine, there's no way of knowing, similar to if the patient had picked it up, there's no way of knowing if they are using that medicine or not. And that's, as we're talking about medicine waste, nobody knows what's happening if it's not the patient. I just wondered how we would manage that scenario, which I think is quite common actually.
It's a problem, but I don't think it's as common as you think. I mean, I think patients do tend to treat, in Scotland anyway, their medicines with a degree of respect, and at some point you have to give them responsibility for the self-management of those, and that's what we're about, supporting that responsibility. And if during conversations with patients, you don't call them consultations, these are conversations because they're people in your community, it's normally quite easy to identify from beliefs, from you know, returns, from actually visiting their homes to see what medicines they're actually using. In the case of if they're using a monitored dosage system, it's eminently apparent if they're not using it, because there's medicines come back to you, returns
So
unused.
it's quite a normal occurrence for a pharmacist to go and visit the patient at
It's
home.
not. It's not
No,
normal.
I've never heard of it before,
It's
but
not.
thank
It's
you
not
for
normal,
doing
and
that.
there's not a formal process for doing it. But I think there's a. When we identify a risk and it's an unknown risk and it's around medicines and medicine can be dangerous, then certainly we take it upon ourselves to double check that patient's doing all right and that the medicines are getting used appropriately, and are finding the patient for a start. So yes, we would, but it's not a formal process. It's something that I'm pretty sure we could build a service around, and we're moving towards with the advent of pharmacotherapy and practice-based pharmacists identifying patients with greater needs. But it's probably a long way off, and it probably has more social care involvement as well. So the integration of health and social care is going to be important in developing such services in the future.
Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, panel. Some of the submissions to Committee on Recycling Unused and Uncollected Medicines have highlighted instances in which risks may not apply. For example, unused medicines in care home and medicines not collected from the community pharmacy. Should medicines which are not collected from a pharmacy or not used in a care home be reused? And if medicines are not collected from a pharmacy, is the pharmacy still reimbursed by the NHS?
I'll maybe start, and then I'm sure Campbell or Jonathan may want to come in here. So I suppose to answer that question, I would start by making reference to my professional standards as a pharmacist. And my professional standards would tell me that if a medicine has left the supply chain, I cannot guarantee the quality of that medicine. So if it's gone out to a care home or a patient's home, I can't be sure that how that medicine's been stored. And therefore, to then think of resupplying or redispensing that medicine to another patient without being sure of the quality would give me some concerns professionally. Within the hospital service, we do reuse medicines. We do, if a patient moves from, our challenges within our hospitals, patients do move around the system quite quickly. So we will manage we will recycle the medicines around the hospital system, but that's because they haven't left the supply chain, and I can be more confident about how those medicines have been stored and looked after during that process.
Once it leaves the building, in your view, it's not.
I can't guarantee the quality.
Yeah. Jonathan Burton.
Yeah, I mean, it really is about, in terms of reuse of medicines, effectively, once something has left the building, you don't have control over the parameters that enable us to guarantee that pharmaceutical is what it says on the tin, so to speak. So, again, our professional standards in pharmacy have always guided us to follow that principle, that once we lose visibility over how that item is looked after or stored, then it's generally deemed inappropriate to reuse that. There has been some challenge to that in recent years, and obviously there is a sort of an environmental aspect to this as well, but as yet none of that has managed to permeate into our sort of core professional guidelines. Some of the trickier aspects of the question that you mentioned there was a mention in the RPS submission around use of medicines in care homes. What that was partially referring to was a situation where you have an item, say for example a nutritional drink type item, which would typically be prescribed to an individual patient, but let's say, you know, a fifth of all the patients in a particular care home need that product. What we've suggested is that we really should be moving to a situation where care homes can effectively bulk order those types of items and draw down from those, so you don't hit a situation where, you know, 20 cartons of a drink are prescribed for a patient, then the recommendation is changed, and then you're left in a situation where you just cannot reuse that item. So there are some simple common sense things, particularly for sort of nutritional and surgical type items, where we may be able to make there may be some easy wins there. Okay. The most complex thing you asked, or the most technical thing, I guess, is, or the most difficult one to answer, is the question of reimbursement for uncollected medicines. Now, part of this is to do with the sort of the electronic payment systems that we have in community pharmacy, and I'm sure my CPS colleagues would be able to elaborate on this and give you a little bit more detail. But it's fair to say that our systems are not technically proficient enough to account for every last tablet in the system that is or isn't collected by a patient. There is a certain amount of professional judgment and fair play and discretion that needs to be administered in the pharmacy in terms of what is submitted for reimbursement and what is not. So, for example, if we dispensed 95 tablets out of 100 for a patient and they never collected 5 of those because we didn't have that 5 in stock at the time and they just sat on our shelves, there is currently no technical way really to sort of make sure that we were only paid for 95 and not 100. The flip side of that is that we are expected to maintain a fairly significant inventory of medicines to make sure that we can promptly supply, and there is no flexibility or reimbursement to contractors in the system for medicines, for example, that may go out of date or may be inadvertently damaged or cannot be used. So there is a bit of technicality around that point, but I guess the answer is that, you know, pharmacists should abide by professional standards when choosing what they are and aren't reimbursed for, and there's a general principle that you are reimbursed for what you dispense, not what you don't, but our systems aren't quite technically proficient to land that on the nail, as it were. Either way.
Can I?
Campbell Shivers.
Yes. The systems aren't, you know, wonderful. They're good. They're getting there, but they're not perfect. We have a 14-day window upon dispensing a prescription within which we can claim it. So normally what happens, the patient has 2 weeks to come and collect that script before we have to scan it to claim it. So we've got that buffer which captures most of the uncollected stuff, because if it's not collected, it gets scanned as not dispensed. That's the guideline. So a lot of the stuff goes not reimbursed. It's submitted as not dispensed if it's not collected. I mean, often you again will contact a patient going, do you know you've got such and such sitting here? But the way the system works, it's rare to have, other than, as Jonathan said, a balance sitting for longer than 14 days. It's very rare.
Can I ask how often that is? How often will there be medicines that are not dispensed, and what then happens to the physical medicine sitting in your shelf?
Statistically, I can't give you the answer. If it's sitting within the pharmacy, it's less than 2 to 3%. I know that. Probably a lot less than that, actually. I'm being generous, but if it's sitting within the pharmacy and it's being stored properly, it goes back onto shelf. So but if it's not being reimbursed, so it's still owned by the pharmacy, if you like.
And how often, to come back to Jonathan Burton's example of the 95 out of 100, how often will that 5% anomaly arise? Is that a frequent occurrence? Or?
Increasingly infrequently, because we've moved towards a situation where the majority of the time we're now using what we would term a patient pack. So apart from examples like antibiotics, where there are lots of different sort of courses and arrangements that you can have, the majority of patients have original pack dispensing, again, that's supported even more now that we've adopted the Falsified Medicines Directive, which is the scanning technology which is designed to ensure that products in our supply chain are genuine and are not counterfeit. So that again reinforces the sort of the importance of original pack dispensing. The other thing I would mention is that as technology moves on, we get better and better at sort of keeping in continuous touch with patients about their medicines. So most of us have text messaging ability. A lot of that is facilitated through NHS mail. So just like you get your NHS text when you get your next dental or optical appointment coming up, pharmacies can utilise that technology and do so to remind patients that their medicines are waiting to be collected. And that can be really handy around bank holiday times, you know, things like that, just making sure that people know that you have their medicines ready for them, and a lot of patients sign up for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I wanted to pursue the issue of communications between pharmacists and prescribers a wee bit more. And in terms of the medicines reviews which you've discussed, and in terms of if someone's had a conversation where you don't think it's appropriate what they've been prescribed, or they don't want to take that medicine, how do you feed that back to a GP? And do you have conflict a lot of the time when you're trying to take, supersede their decision around a prescription?
If I can answer that. In practice, no, we don't have conflict. It's about reaching a consensus with the patient, first off. So if the patient expresses doubts or concerns about medicine, then you can't allay them using all your professional knowledge and skills. Then the prescriber has a responsibility to reach a consensus with the patient as to what they can have to best treat their condition. But as a community pharmacist, you're not piggy in the middle, you're part of a triumvirate, and you will feed that back to GP and say, look, patient X is not taking this because I think he or she should have is not part of the conversation. If the GP seeks our advice, we can offer it. And sometimes we do, depending on the relationship. But it's about the GP then to go back to the patient and reach a consensus with the patient, as far as I'm concerned. Occasionally, supplementary, you'll get a GP phoning, right, what would you recommend in the circumstances? And we'll offer a recommendation then. But conflict's rare, really rare.
Thank you. Through the implementation of the new GMS contract, we're seeing an increasing number of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians working within the GP practices to support what's called the Pharmacotherapy Service. And so what I'm noticing, certainly in my board, is that we're seeing much better partnership working between the pharmacy teams in the practices and the community pharmacists, so that when these types of issues arise, there can be a conversation that, as Campbell says, has the patient at the centre, to ensure that the best outcome is achieved for the patient.
Angela, to me.
Thanks. So just to pick up on what Gail has said, so in NHS Lothian and in most boards across Scotland, we've got really good working relationships between pharmacists and general practitioners. We've long-standing experience of working with our GP colleagues, speaking to them about the new formulary recommendations, suggesting the formularies change. You might want to think about changing new patients, new clinical guidelines that have come into place, new evidence about adverse effects with medicines. I think the GPs expect those conversations to come from us, and actually they tend to be in a very educational and very supportive professional environment. So I would say that's a strength of the system that we have in primary care.
And can I ask, do you record that data? You know, we know all the issues with poor IT and access to patient records, but when you've not prescribed something which a GP has sent someone with a prescription to you, do you record the fact that that's been reviewed and then taken off yourselves?
Yeah, I think the honest answer to that is it's just a matter of the pharmacist's professional discretion and judgment as to whether they record keep around those events. And you do raise a good point in that it's very difficult for us to collect data around this. And it's a personal frustration of mine because it means that a lot of the good work, certainly that happens in community pharmacy practice, effectively is completely invisible. I would say that, yeah, generally speaking, you know, you're always going to get local variations, but relationships are usually very good between community pharmacies and GP practices. There will be frustrations there from time to time, and some of that will be to do with the ability of professionals to speak directly with one another. And part of that is it's almost a symptom of the fact that, again, we're not really properly plugged into the system. So, you know, every time I spot a discrepancy on a prescription, I need to make a judgment call. Is this a technical thing that just needs me to send it back with a note? And yes, we are still in the world of post-it notes. It's shameful, really, but we are sometimes. Or is it something I need to pick up the phone and speak directly to my sort of clinical colleague about? Because there's a real sort of patient clinical aspect to this, which is very individual to that prescription. Or is it a more general issue? It may be a medicine supply issue that I need to flag with the GP just to say, hey, we're having an issue with this medicine or this group of medicines. Can we have a think about our sort of preferred choices for this patient group so that we don't keep hitting up against this time and time again? But you know, there are some really good conversations that happen there. I'll give you an example. I'll sort of anonymize it and sort of change some of the details, but just 5 or 6 days ago at work, I received an antibiotic prescription for a patient. The patient had a sort of slightly atypical sort of skin condition, and the antibiotic dose on the prescription was really quite high, something I'd not experienced before. So I felt that that was worth a telephone query because I really wanted to get to the bottom of what the issue with that was. You know, was it a genuine sort of prescribing error, or was it something so specialist that I maybe just didn't have visibility? It might have been a consultant recommendation, something like that. And now, obviously, because I don't have any visibility over the patient's notes, even, you know, with their consent, I'm flying blind at this point, so I need to phone the GP and we need to start right from the beginning with this, and I need to tell them why I'm phoning, and then they need to tell me what they've done to get to that point, and then we eventually reached a consensus that actually the dose was a little bit high and we needed to sort of manage that down a little bit. So I explained to the GP that I'd, you know, gone to my usual references and I knew a little bit about the condition involved, and I hadn't really come across this before. We actually had a really good professional to professional conversation about it, and actually that was a real bridge builder. It was a locum GP. I'm sure we'll probably have more conversations in the future because there's a little bit of trust there now, because we spoke to each other in a sort of polite and professional manner, and we worked the problem and we solved it. Those types of conversations happen all the time, but it is completely invisible, and it is made more difficult by the fact that we're effectively fenced out of the IT, and that's frustrating for our GP colleagues as well. And it's also frustrating for our GP practice pharmacist colleagues, because I would like to have better communication with them, although that is, I would agree with the previous speaker around the point of our community pharmacy teams and our GP practice pharmacy teams, be they pharmacists or techs, are starting to have a lot of these conversations, because when it's a purely technical medicine thing, we can work that problem together, no issue at all. And as long as there's a bit of trust and respect on both sides there, then that's actually a really good thing. But yeah, the communication could be made easier for us.
So thinking about, you know, your day-to-day professional life, what sort of percentage, obviously a guesstimate, Do you think this is the case where
Okay.
it's a an inappropriate prescription or a query over a
Okay.
prescription?
Well, there have been studies done. Now, this is a complete off the top of my head statistic, and either back me up or shoot me down here, colleagues, but is it around 5% of scripts have something technically not quite right about them, but that encompasses a whole range of things, from something that is clinically inappropriate to something which is a purely technical issue, which is not a patient safety issue. That was the figure I had. But there have been actually some fairly large studies around rates of prescribing and errors, and others may be able to elaborate on that.
It might be good to have, if you are able afterwards to track
no
that
problem.
down, that would perhaps be helpful. Is it something that the Royal Pharmaceutical Society might have a role in terms of collecting that information and data?
Yeah, we'll be able to pull that out, because there have been some reasonably decent-sized studies around prescribing safety and the rates of prescription errors. But again, they do cover quite a wide, what they class as an error is maybe not what we would class as a true medical error. It covers clerical, small sort of typos and things like that.
Gail Caldwell.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for the committee to see some of those pieces of work, and I think that would be helpful. I suppose just to maybe build on Jonathan's point about the importance of access to records for community pharmacists. So we in Glasgow and Clyde, we're now in a position where 63% of our community pharmacy contractors have access to clinical portals. So that's the electronic patient record. And what we're doing is we're gathering evidence where harm has been prevented by the community pharmacists having access to those records. So very recently we had an example where a patient had attended an outpatient clinic. A recommendation was made from that outpatient clinic to the GP. The GP prescribed a medicine for that patient, and when the patient presented that prescription to the community pharmacist, something wasn't quite right. When the pharmacist started to have the conversation with the patient, there was something not quite right about her understanding of that medicine. So with the patient's consent, the pharmacist was able to access Clinical Portal, could look at the outpatient letter and actually discovered that it was the wrong medicine that had been prescribed. So it builds on the point that Jonathan's made about errors, but without access to that information, that's an error that might not have been detected. And so access to information for our community pharmacists to support safer dispensing, I think, is really important.
So I think the committee would be very encouraged to hear about that. Can you tell us what the process has been to reach 63% of community pharmacists having access, and what's required to reach 100%?
So it's about been working through within the board, first of all, the information governance issues, the discussions with our Caldecott Guardian, establishing the appropriate role-based access. So it wouldn't be appropriate for community pharmacists to see the whole of the clinical record, but there's absolutely some issues such as outpatient letters, as I've mentioned, information about drugs and medicines that are given to the patient on discharge. There are key parts of the record that's important. So as well as the information governance issues, we have worked through what we call role-based access arrangements, so agreeing what the appropriate fields are that the community pharmacist can see. And then it's down to the technical aspects, and that's why we're at 63%, is because we've got some technical challenges with some of our community pharmacists that we're working through. So we've made progress very quickly since the end of last year. So it's just about working through the technical aspects of how we're going to share that information with the wide range of community pharmacists. Okay,
thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Good morning to the panel. If I could sort of expand on a point you made, Gail Caldwell, around the GMS contract, new GMS contract. We took evidence that suggested that the increased role of pharmacy within general practice is leading to a workforce issue, not just with pharmacists but with pharmacy technicians. And I think that some of the submissions were calling for that expanded role, and it was again a point that Jonathan Burton made around trying to create the time for a pharmacist to do the job that a pharmacist is trained to do, and ensure that the sort of best use of skills and training. And I wonder if the panel would consider the role of a pharmacy technician, and perhaps the ability to maybe expand that and allow them to dispense medicines, for example.
Can I speak to that? Thank you. So the point you've raised is really important. The new Pharmacotherapy Service has built on lots of experience we've developed over 20 years in Scotland of pharmacists working in GP practices with their GP colleagues. The Pharmacotherapy Service was partly a GMS contract response to the challenges that GPs are having in terms of meeting patient needs, the change in demographics. What we're now at, we're at the stage of the service is just evolving. We're now moving on from pharmacists doing some of these tasks to technicians doing some of these tasks. We actually need to move further than that and have support workers and admin and clerical staff, and we need to get clarity on who can do each of those roles best. Within NHS Lothian, in order to address some of the issues around skills gap, we have just created a workforce. We have funded 30 people to become pharmacy technicians in NHS Lothian, working with Edinburgh College. So we're trying to build a workforce, we're trying to maximise the use of the pharmacy technician professionals working to the top of their licence as well. And at the moment, I would say that we're moving in a strong direction. I think there's lots of pressures in the system. There's pressures in community pharmacy. There's pressures on my hospital service as well around the number of staff. But workforce is an issue across the NHS as a whole at the moment. And what we're trying to do, and what many people are trying to do, is actually to bring in people who, not taking from one part of the service and using it somewhere else, but actually developing new staff and new capacity within the system. I don't know if that addresses your question, but effectively we're using technicians within our GP practices to the top of their licence so they can do as much as possible, and the pharmacists are then allocating pieces of work to them so that they can actually give an oversight to that and work on the more complex queries and more complex issues with patients.
Yeah. It's not the first time that I'd heard evidence from, let's call it a high street, a well-known high street chain, to say that they had actually looked at developing their the sort of pharmacy technicians to be able to dispense medication and other skills, only to be plundered by the NHS and take that workforce away. So the incentive for pharmacy to develop their pharmacy technicians obviously is an issue here. I don't know if that's something that you are aware of or perhaps could comment on.
I think you do raise a good point, and what you're describing is, as Angela says, is how we're developing the pharmacy technician profession to work at the top of their licence. So many pharmacy technicians will train as what we call accuracy checking technicians. So they will be their skills will be developed to allow them to check a prescription when it has been clinically screened by a pharmacist. And you're right, and perhaps Campbell and Jonathan may want to comment here. Often these accuracy checking technicians are trained within the community pharmacy environment and then will sometimes then come and work in our hospital pharmacy. So we do get quite a bit of movement of staff, and therefore it's really important that we have a pipeline for our pharmacy technician workforce so that we can grow a pharmacy technician workforce in and for primary care. And as Angela has described, the work that NHS Lothian are doing is really setting the precedent around how we do that. But there are anecdotal reports of pharmacy technicians being trained in community pharmacy and not retained there, and then moving into other environments such as the hospital pharmacy service.
Jonathan Burton.
Yeah, I mean, this is as most workforce issues are, it's really quite complex, and there's lots of different levels to this. Some of it is paying conditions, HR related. In our submission as RPS, we've put a lot of focus on career pathways for pharmacy technicians, and I would actually expand that to career pathways for pharmacy support staff in general. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I think we need to have an appreciation across the various services that we offer, that we need to get our workforce planning right. pharmacists and pharmacy tech skills and knowledge are in demand, you know, across primary and secondary care. So we do need a pipeline, but we also need to think about, you know, what these individuals are doing in practice. And certainly from a community pharmacy practice point of view, if you look at the way that the contract is evolving and developing, you know, we're just about to launch the next phase of our sort of pharmacy first, patient-facing walk-in services. You know, these changes they're fundamentally changing the demands on pharmacy teams. So there is still the technical demand there for the accurate and the safe supply of medicine. But what pharmacists in community practice also need around them now are people who are good clerically, who are good in a reception sense, you know, who can manage consultation workflow as well as manage prescription workflow. And I think there are great opportunities there, especially for our technician workforce. And we shouldn't just be thinking of our technicians as an additional help in the dispensing process, although that is vital, but also how can our workforce help to support our increasing consultation-based workload. And I think, you know, we can create some really attractive careers there. And, you know, talking about pipeline, I think we do need to recognize that the NHS really likes its pharmacists and its techs. And, you know, we do need some assistance in terms of promoting pharmacy as a career right from a sort of school level. We are traditionally very back office. That is changing rapidly. And I think there's a lot of young people in Scotland who would have an awful lot to offer our profession. So we really need to shine a bit of a light on that as well. And I think as a profession, we would ask Scottish Government for as much assistance as they could give us with that.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for your submissions. A lot of good information in there. I want to move on from community pharmacy or pharmacists in the community to pharmacies in the hospital. Now, we have had evidence, we've heard evidence in regards to unnecessary delays with pharmacies waiting for prescription, etc. So therefore that has a knock-on effect on the discharge in that respect. So first question I wanted to ask was what are the causes of pharmacy delays in hospitals and what can be done to address them?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. So when medicines are supplied to a patient on discharge, what we need first is an accurate prescription from the prescriber. And sometimes the delays that are placed in the pharmacy are often because we don't have a prescription. So on the ward round in the morning, you're told at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can go home today. And sometimes it can be well into the afternoon before that junior doctor gets round to actually writing the prescription. Meanwhile, the patient's sitting potentially in a discharge lounge waiting for the medicines, but we in pharmacy don't actually have a prescription. So the process is quite complex. Also, when we're supplying medicines for patient discharge, we also have to make sure that they're right. So we know that the transitions of care, when patients move from acute care to primary care, we know that's quite risky in terms of communication. So we have to undertake what we call medicines reconciliation at that stage. So we have to make sure the medicines are right. So we've often got delays in the actual availability of the prescription, and we also have to make sure it's accurate. Now, we know from data in Glasgow and Clyde that it takes around about 3 hours from when we receive a prescription to get that medicine ready. And we know in our hospitals we have real significant challenges with capacity and flow. And for a patient to wait even 3 hours for a medicine when they've told that they can go home doesn't feel very person-centred. So we've recently submitted a bid to look at a new model for discharge supply. And that builds on examples from other systems across the world. So New Zealand, for example, where if you're going home from hospital, and again it comes back to the need for access to information, we could transfer the electronic prescription, the electronic immediate discharge letter, to the community pharmacists, who could pick up the supply, and then when the patient's on their way home, somebody, if they're able to, could pop in and collect that medicine. So I think we need to keep the systems that we have under review. We need to make sure that they are person-centred, and I agree, the hospital discharge process is not as person-centred as I would like it to be. And so some of these new ways of working, where we could transfer that information to the community pharmacists, they could pick up the supply and perhaps deliver that to the patient's home, or someone collect it, and then support the information sharing with the practice around what's happened during that hospital discharge. I think that's the way to go to try and improve those systems that currently impact on patients going home.
Thank you very much. Having waited 5 hours sometimes, and obviously the pharmacist is sometimes closed, so therefore you're not allowed out, you've got to stay in for that night. It seems an absolutely crazy system. You were saying, Gail, that it's a consultant that's got to prescribe. So you've got a big blockage there then, because they're very busy. And they've got to prescribe that, then they've got this waiting time for people, etc., etc. So obviously it's a lack of electronic, prescribing methods. So HEMPA, would that be helpful in that respect? Will it alleviate these delays? And I notice, Professor Timoney, that in your submission of NHS Lothian, you had mentioned that it's important that the government funding commitment to HEMPA, obviously Hospital Electronic Prescribing and Medicines Administration, is honoured. So I wonder if anyone in the panel could elaborate on that. And if HEMPA did come in as a system, would that alleviate this situation we have, every day in hospitals, where people are waiting sometimes 4 or 5 hours?
Yeah, so thanks for your question. You've asked a couple of questions there, and I'll come to HEPMA second, if that's okay. I think one of the things you need to recognise is that patients who are in hospital, not every one of them will have seen a pharmacist. A pharmacist will not have seen them. We're a short resource, so we basically have to risk and prioritise those who we think either are on risky medicines or have conditions where we would be concerned about medicines and medicines use. Because of that, by the time the prescription comes to pharmacy, then it may not have had that clinical check. That's the inevitability of the pace of what's going on in hospitals at the present time. The patients come in, they go out quite quickly. The juniors, to be fair to them, are the ones that are writing the prescriptions, not the consultants. But the juniors know that they've got somebody else coming into that bed, and they've got to actually get them clerked in as well. Everything in the system is running quite hot at the moment, I would say. And so we recognise that it's not perfect. And sometimes when things run hot, actually you get clogs in the system you shouldn't have. So that describes the situation that we have at the present time. In terms of HEPMA, it's a Hospital Electronic Prescribing and Medicines Administration System. I think it's absolutely essential that we get this across all hospitals in NHS Scotland. We have really good systems in primary care. We have seen the quality of prescribing in primary care improve dramatically in the past 20 years as we've had more data to review what's happening, to make recommendations about practice and to feed back to prescribers. That's what we'll be doing with the HEPMA system as well. We'll be able to see, first of all, if the prescribing is in line with our formulary, if it's in line with the clinical recommendations. We'll be able to see in terms of medicines administration if patients have got their medicines, and we'll be using that as a process to actually improve the quality of care for patients. Some of that, I hope, will result in the fact that patients will have their medicines available for them when they're being discharged because the system is working more efficiently. But it's not specifically designed around discharge, it's actually designed, I think, around improving the quality of care for patients when they're in our hospital service for us. And I think it's a critical issue. We've talked about it a little bit, but for me, one of the strong messages I would like this committee to get is actually we need to be living in the modern world. We need to be using big data to drive improvements in care. And one of the challenges that we have is that our systems, first of all, we don't have a particularly strong system in the hospital service as yet, but even in community pharmacy, and the ability for us to actually move across interfaces and use that data to drive improvements in care would be a critical change and a real improvement in care for patients.
Just to give the committee a sense of the scale of prescribing in hospitals. So across Glasgow and Clyde, we prescribe 5 million prescriptions, inpatient prescriptions, and that generates 24 million medicines administration episodes. And that's all handled on paper just now. It's a paper prescription that's used. And as Angela said, that provides us with no decision support. So there's no point of prescribing support for the individual around drug interactions, and it also means there's a lot of handwriting in our hospitals. And so I think, as Angela says, the introduction of HEPMA as well as the patient safety data will reduce the amount of transcription that is required, and that will improve the efficiency of the system. And I think if we can link information on prescribing with patient outcomes, it goes back to Angela's earlier point about really getting a sense of the true value of medicines in the system. So not just about the cost, but actually, are we getting the patient outcomes that we're trying to achieve with these medicines? And by having data, we can start to really understand that.
A lot of wards these days appear to operate with a lot of the clinical decisions being made by physician associates or nurse practitioners. What difference does prescribing, the opportunity for those professions to prescribe, what difference would that make?
So at the moment we have lots of nurse prescribers in our systems, we have lots of pharmacist prescribers, we've also got radiographers, physiotherapists. At the moment physicians, assistants and associates are not a regulated profession, so they're not able to prescribe, but I understand that's expected to change later in the year. Mm-hmm. I think that's really helpful because actually they're working closely with patients, but actually it'll add complexity to the system as well, which is why I think we need to use technical solutions and use data-driven solutions so that for all prescribers, not just for individual groups.
Over the last few months, National Services Scotland have held have held 3 what they're calling discovery workshops. And it's to exactly look at that point about how currently our systems for prescribing and dispensing will work in a multidisciplinary context. And we're expecting the report from that work quite soon. But issues like true electronic prescribing in primary care as well as in secondary care, I think will come through quite strongly in that work. So it may be that the committee will want to have a look at that discovery piece when it's published by NSS.
A couple of quick supplementaries, Brian Whittle and then Emma Harper.
Thank you, Kira. Just on the role of HEPMA, I mean, that's within a secondary care environment. What's your sense then that once they step outside of a secondary care environment, that data collected by HEPMA will transpose itself into primary care and sort of give that sort of patient-centred care? Because surely that data, that patient data, will be required by a primary care and pharmacy once they step outside of a hospital.
Absolutely, and that's the next step. So that's why I was saying I think the issue for me is once we get HEPMA in place in the hospital service, then it's about that connectivity across the interfaces, because at the moment that does not exist. I mean, it's probably quite shocking for patients if they realise just how little we know about the medicines they have in hospital, and a lot of it depends on us having medicines governance systems in place. So we have formularies across primary and secondary care. We can look at compliance with that. We hope that our prescribers, as part of their continuing professional development and their attention to detail, but actually sharing that information so we can see what's really happening. At the moment, those systems are not there, and I think it's something that has to happen.
Yeah. You'll call it.
Ayrshire is probably the health, well, it's not probably, Ayrshire has the most mature implementation of HEPMA in NHS Scotland. And they have recently started to take an extract from HEPMA when the patient is discharged from hospital and share that with primary care. So that not only shows the medicines that the patient's on at discharge, it shows the journey of those medicines during the patient's stay. It shows what's been started, what's been stopped, and the reasons for that. And as you say, that rightly then provides very rich information for for primary care colleagues and ideally to community pharmacy colleagues to get a sense of the changes that have been made and the reasons why.
Jonathan Burton.
Yeah, it was Just to come back really on the topic of the perception of medicine supply in hospitals and the frustrations around some of particularly the issues on discharge. And I just wanted to speak, I guess, to the human element of our pharmacists working in hospitals in Scotland. A sizable number of hospital pharmacists are members of RPS, and they've been speaking to us about how they feel about this. And, you know, what I would say is that, you know, we have a lot of pharmacists, and actually some of our more junior hospital pharmacists going through the initial stages of their sort of post-registration training, working incredibly hard to make sure that patients and their medicines are stewarded safely, both on admission into hospital and importantly on discharge from hospitals. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that where we're at with our systems does not really do justice to the hard work that they put into keeping our population safe. At RPS, we're in the process of doing a big piece of work around mental health in the pharmacist workforce, and we have some of the provisional findings of a big survey that we conducted towards the end of last year. And it makes quite difficult reading, and the issues around stress in the workplace are not confined to any one sector of our profession, and I think that's a symptom of the fact that our services are in great demand, which is really good. That's positive, you know, but we have a lot of pharmacists and technicians in our workforce just working incredibly hard to keep the show on the road. And I know we're not unique in that regard as a profession, but I think that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that, yeah, once our systems come along and we become more connected, then, you know, that will hopefully display the good work that's been done a little bit more openly. And we need to remember that as our pharmacists are increasingly committed to the admission and discharge process, that potentially leads to less pharmacist time on the wards, and it's traditionally pharmacists and their expertise that supports our medical colleagues in making good and prompt decisions which would lead to smoother discharge. So again, there is a resource issue here. You know, medicines are complex, they're a massive expense in our health service, they're fraught with risk, therefore our pharmacists need to be all over that at all stages of the process, and ultimately that will lead to a better experience for patients. And I do agree, and I really support the move towards investigating the possibility of some more sort of outpatient discharge type dispensing through community pharmacies, and I think that's a positive thing to keep our relationships going with our patients, because quite often they become invisible when they're in hospital, although we have made great inroads in that regard. In Ayrshire and Arran, in Forth Valley, we have full visibility electronically over discharge notes, and we know when our patients have gone into hospital, but we don't know why. So there's movement in the right direction, but yeah, I would like to pay tribute to our pharmacists working in our hospitals who work incredibly hard to keep patients, when they're at their most vulnerable and poorly, safe.
Good, thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thanks. I hope I'm not opening up a can of worms, but blister packs, are they part of HEPMA recording or community pharmacy recording? Because blister packs are supposed to improve efficiency, maybe reduce waste, support safety, but there's then a manual component of who's assembling the blister packs, and obviously that takes time as well. But electronically, are we recording who's on a blister pack, or then who needs to be on a blister pack? Because we know that that's something that has pros and cons either way.
So maybe if I can start, and it might be a can of worms, but so in terms of where we might start with communication between our hospital and our community pharmacy colleagues, then I think patients who are on compliance aids are often a high risk patient group, and so it's very important that our community pharmacy colleagues know when a patient who's on a compliance aid or a blister pack is admitted to hospital, and when they come home to give them adequate information and time to pick up the continuity of supply. If I can add a comment about blister packs and compliance aids, sometimes they are viewed as the panacea. In my view, I don't think that's the case. I think, yes, they are one solution to supporting patients to take their medicines as intended, but they can bring risks. Some of the medicines are not stable in a compliance aid, and I think it also can disempower the patient. And sometimes it would be better, in my view, that that patient had a polypharmacy review, that other strategies such as medicines administration records, MAR charts, large labels, technology that could support better compliance are explored. So I think it is an important area of risk that we need to communicate better, but I'm not sure compliance aids are necessarily the panacea.
Okay.
Thank you very much. David Torrance. Oh, sorry.
Just to give a community perspective on what Gail was saying about compliance aids, and just to reiterate the point about them not being a panacea, they aren't. They have a place, and it's a very specific time in a patient's lifetime or journey where they can be very useful, but they do increase risk, different risks rather than decrease them. And as Gail said, there are other strategies that are better choices and probably more cost effective and just clinically effective in terms of supporting a patient with prompting, deprescribing, polypharmacy reviews, reducing the complexity of their dosage regimes, you know, going from instead of 5 times a day to twice a day, or just even nighttime dosing. So it's a much more complex area, and the solution isn't always just to stick somebody in a compliance device. And just to speak purely from a community pharmacy perspective, the workload attached to these for us is enormous, absolutely colossal, because we've got to assess the risk of these, and the more you have, the more complex it all becomes, and the more people you have to employ. And it's, you know, dispensing an MTS pack remunerates us in exactly the same way as dispensing a serial prescription under a care package. So there's no driver from us to do them. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Very helpful. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Community pharmacies spend more time, reportedly, trying to procure medicines, and in hospitals, many medicines are procured centrally by procurement. How well does the central procurement model deal with medicine shortages?
I'll speak to that. And I know this question was asked previously, and Lindsay McClure spoke to this from National Procurement. We work very closely with Lindsay around procuring medicines for our services, and they've currently shifted a little bit in terms of their procurement approach, so that rather than being procuring purely on the basis of price and the basis of cost, it's procuring on the basis of actually having consistency of service, having a fallback, and making sure that the suppliers to us, if they're not able to supply because there's a shortage in one area, they can actually supply from somewhere else. So that's helped us. But medicine shortages are a big problem within pharmacy at the present time, and it affects both community pharmacy and hospital pharmacy. We normally run at a rate of about 80 shortages at any one time. It's probably run about 120, 130 at the moment. And we spend a lot of our time making sure that we've got the medicines. We grade them according to what is the risk associated with these medicines. And we have shortages with some really important medicines, chemotherapies and so forth, that we have to make some decisions about patients' treatment, whether we've got enough to last for the course of treatment, if we're going to start a new patient on it. And it's part of the work that we do on a regular basis. National Procurement do a great job, but if there's no medicine available, it's a just-in-time process. If there's no medicine available and they can't get it, then we all struggle with that.
Jonathan Burton.
Yeah, and again, I would defer to Lindsay's comments on central procurement. She's the real expert there, and I think the picture that she highlighted was that for very particular examples such as flu vaccination, there can be benefits, but when it comes to the wider scope of medicines that we supply through secondary and primary care, which is absolutely huge, then it is, our current system is actually pretty robust. And I would just like to make a comment about the way that patients receive their medicines as well, which in Scotland is through our network of about 1,250 community pharmacies and an additional number of dispensing doctor practices. And I think we need to remember and value how robust and how locally versatile that medicine supply service is. So when the chips are down, when there's like 3 feet of snow, we get our skis on and we get the medicines to people in those communities. It gets done. And I think that is incredibly important, especially when you're dealing with remote and rural communities. So our supply chain is very spidery. It's more complex than it's ever been. We have some frustrations around direct supply models where companies will effectively trade their medicines directly to us rather than through a wholesaler, which basically means we just have to have more phone calls, more emails, more websites visited, more methods of communication. But the fact that we have wholesalers that supply a myriad of different medications, and we have pharmacies locally all over the country, does make the system fairly bulletproof and means that we have a little bit of a cushion when things go wrong. But there's no doubt that medicine supply issues, in primary care, it's taking up a lot of pharmacy staff time, a lot of pharmacist time. It's taking a lot of GP time, certainly taking a lot of GP practice pharmacist time, because a lot of the communication we do around these shortages is with our GP practice pharmacist colleagues. Community Pharmacy Scotland have excellent guidance in this regard. And in Scotland, the way that we interpret the medicine supply guidance actually gives us quite a lot more flexibility as practitioners about how we deal with supply problems as opposed to our colleagues in the other devolved nations. So I think that's worthy of note. But yeah, there's no doubt that it's very resource intensive and it's very frustrating, because every minute that we spend trying to source an awkward medicine is a minute less that we're spending with our patients.
Thank you.
George.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. We've heard that over the past couple of weeks that branded drugs cost obviously a lot more than generic drugs, and generic drugs on the whole are the most dispensed, but still the branded ones are the ones that cost quite a bit. Now, Community Pharmacy Scotland have asked for pharmacists to have the power to substitute branded drugs with generic drugs. Now, as a politician and a legislator looking at this, we'd have to change the legislation to do that, but that sounds as if it makes sense to me. Do you support this call from Community Pharmacy Scotland, and if not, why not?
So I would always encourage generic prescribing and the supply of generic medicines where it's clinically appropriate to do so. There are some situations where we cannot use a generic medicine. So if I take, for example, drugs like medicines for epilepsy or medicines for theophylline type medicines, calcium channel blockers, it's quite important that medicines that they're specifically prescribed for an individual patient and you can't substitute that brand. So although I would support generic prescribing and generic dispensing, and we do that within our boards, and our generic prescribing rates can be up to 80–90%, there will be a small percentage of patients where it's clinically important that they maintain a supply of a branded medicine. Sometimes it's about preference. I'm not suggesting that it's based on patient preference, although that can be important too if it leads to good compliance. But for certain clinical conditions, it is important that we use branded medicines where appropriate.
Thank you for your question. So the first thing to recognise, I suppose, is that branded medicines have a patent, and manufacturers have that patent for a period of, usually by the time it comes to market, between 10 and 12 years. So they have exclusivity, and that rewards their research and development costs. There won't be a generic available. A generic is only available after the branded medicine patent has expired. At that point in time, as Gail said, then we would support that all patients get generic medicines, except where there's a narrow therapeutic index to the drug or there's clear reasons why you must stay with the brand. We work quite closely to make sure that happens, and I would be supportive of substitution if necessary. We do have high generic prescribing rates. They are about 85%, so the margins around that are quite small, and some of that brand of prescribing will be because the product still has a patent. So it's just to recognise there's a small margin for efficiencies there, but I'm supportive of it.
Just coming back as well to the previous discussion about shortages. Recently, in fact, at the end of last year, we introduced the series shortage protocol, So as part of the planning for EU exit, then if shortages escalated, then there is now guidance whereby the community pharmacists can substitute for certain shortages for certain patients in certain conditions. And so that might be a scenario where we would want to have that legislative power and availability and process to be able to do that where we had a serious shortage and it was important to maintain the supply chain for a particular type or class of medicine.
I'm aware that obviously there's a patent for branded medicine. My wife is MS, so I've heard all the various wonder drugs that come in for MS and under branded products with that as well. But one of the things that and that's a whole different kind of kettle of fish, can of worms that we'd be opening up if we started talking that, how drugs companies come to their costs with that. But one of the things, I'm assuming what your answer was that along the lines, Gail, that, you know, as long as it's correct for the condition you're dealing with and everything else. But I'm assuming when Community Pharmacy Scotland have asked for this, we're assuming a parity of professionalism and they're obviously going to prescribe something that is correct for the individual. You know, so I can't see how your idea that I couldn't see a pharmacist obviously saying with someone with epilepsy, like the example you gave, actually prescribing something that would be different that wouldn't help the individual, you know. So I'm trying to kind of work out what your answer really meant there.
Okay, and so I guess my answer, I'll try and say it in a different way. I would support generic prescribing and generic medicines use where it's safe and appropriate to do so. And I'm sure most of my colleagues in community pharmacy and primary care and hospital pharmacy would support that. Angela has articulated the branded products, the patent, etc. And again, the narrow therapeutic index where it would be appropriate clinically for a branded medicine to be continued. So I'm looking to my right here in the hope that Campbell will come in, but I think professionally we would support generic prescribing and generic dispensing where it's safe and appropriate to do so.
I totally agree with everything that Gail has just said, and I think our request probably is a bit of conflation with serious shortages in England, and you know what we were facing last year, you know, 2 or 3 times, and again at the end of this year. Whereas the possibility that medicine supply will be interrupted, and it was really that request was in that context. You know, just to reinforce what Gail was saying, when a medicine goes out of patent, there's nobody in Scotland that's quicker than the health boards that's switching the drug to generic as soon as possible. The efficiencies here are very limited because the boards manage it so well already. But our request was really about, you know, serious shortages and emergency supply situations.
Thank you very much. David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'm going to ask a few questions around hospital expenditure on drugs. Why is it that expenditure on medicines in hospitals have been much, much higher than general hospital costs?
Okay, thank you. So medicines expenditure in the NHS represents about 17% of board spend now. And we are seeing an increasing proportion of that spend in hospital setting. And I think some of that is really good news for patients. We're seeing a lot of new medicines coming through for cancer, for MS, for ophthalmology, that are offering significant benefits. So, for example, we've seen our expenditure on cancer medicines grow by 133%. And so that is about offering patients more options, more effective choices. I suppose from a board perspective, one of the challenges is the issue over access to new medicines and the flexibility that's been applied to that. And so what we now see in boards is increased access to medicines that traditionally we may not have considered to be cost effective. In line with our HTA process. And so boards are making available now through the changes to the policy position in Scotland, as I say, to medicines that are no longer, well, we would consider no longer to be cost effective. And that has an impact in that it diverts resources away from other interventions that we may consider to be cost effective. And if I can perhaps make a point around how we see medicines as part of the overall pathway of care. And I'm aware of some work in Ayrshire and Arn, if we take, slightly tangential here, but if we take the management of COPD and the use of what's called the COPD value pyramid. And what that does is it puts medicines in the context of other interventions that are more cost effective than the medicines. So we know for COPD, giving patients flu vaccination, giving access to smoking cessation, giving access to pulmonary rehab services are more cost effective and deliver better outcomes than medicines. So there is something for me about how do we see medicines as the overall pathway of care.
Sure, obviously I have other witnesses in a second. I mean, that's interesting, and I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. But if we look at a bit of history, if you go back over the last 6 years, and I thank Spice for this information, if you look at the compound average growth rate in drugs, in hospitals it's been 6.6%, which is miles higher than normal inflation rate. Obviously, I'm aware the NHS generally inflation rate would be higher, but putting that to one side, all hospital costs have gone up 1.5%. I mean, that's a horrendous difference. And as you know, the committee looks at all the territorial boards and others, and one of the big factors in brokerage and boards, and some of our witnesses here can talk about that, has been massive growth in drug costs within hospitals, almost to the extent of unmanageable costs. So I suppose my other argument is, whilst I accept everything you said, is there any issue here around management, control, efficiency, that is also something we need to look at? Because frankly, some of our boards in Scotland, and I worry when I say this, but there's a lot in this, are frankly financially unsustainable, and drug costs are a factor.
So perhaps I can describe to you what we do in the acute service in NHS Lothian to try and manage our drug costs. Picking up on what Gail has said, I fully support everything she said in terms of some of the reasons for it. You need to recognise that with the increasing throughput through hospitals, the people going through it more quickly, we will have more people on more drugs, frail elderly patients. So what we've done in NHS Lothian is that for the past 7 years, we have an acute prescribing forum, which meets once a month. It's co-chaired by the medical director for the acute service and my associate director for pharmacy. We meet with 2 groups from clinical areas each month, and we ask them to come to us. It's doctors, pharmacists, the business managers and the finance managers from that area, and come to describe us what's the budget you have for your area, what are the trends in terms of drug usage, what's your compliance with the formulary, are you expected to stay within budget? If not, what steps are you taking to address that? We also work across the whole of the service to try to manage switches to biosimilars, try to manage switches in terms of home care. And as a result of that, within NHS Lothian, we have saved £24 million of the drugs bill in the past 7 years. So that's an average of £3.7 million per annum. And that has actually managed to help us contain our drug costs. So actually, it would be, it's not much good to hear this, but it would be much bigger if we weren't actually doing all of this work alongside it. It requires lots of work with our clinical staffing groups to make sure that we're clear about the reasons why we're using drugs, why we're looking at high-cost drugs, and the reasons why the drugs are on the formulary or not on the formulary. It's a characteristic of the medicines that are coming through. We have to, and in the hospital service, of course, we're more likely to be using newer drugs, which will be branded drugs, and the cost associated with that.
Could I move? Sorry.
Just to build on Angela's point, I think Angela's right. There's a lot of work in boards to manage the cost of medicines in acute care, and it is a challenge. And so just to give you a few examples, and building on the point earlier that the committee were exploring about the role of national procurement. In Glasgow and Clyde, our costs for hepatitis C medicines have gone from 22 million to 7.5 million. So we've driven down the cost of the medicine while still treating the same number of patients, and in fact treating more patients through very effective procurement strategies and also national consistency and buying power around how we treat these conditions. Angela mentioned biosimilars, so moving from biologics to biosimilars. These medicines have required careful handling with patients, conversations with patients about switching from one biologic for their rheumatoid arthritis to another, to a biosimilar. And that saved our organisation £6 million in 1 year. So I think we can give you lots of examples of how boards are managing the increasing growth in medicines expenditure, but the policy position around increasing access to medicines is also impacting significantly on our acute services.
Again, through you, Convener, I mean, I think all these examples are excellent, and obviously it's good if we can see some of these being rolled out across all the 14 territorial boards, because I think certainly what we've picked up is some issues of postcode lottery. For some boards do excellent work in this. There is certainly problems with overspend, which causes issues or indeed in end brokerage, as you well know. Could I ask another question? Maybe the community colleagues can come in. And I'm conscious before I ask it, I may be comparing apples with pears. But if you look at the primary care drug costs, that's got over the same period, which is 6-7 years, that's been 3.6% compared to 6.6% in the hospital setting, where all primary care costs have gone up 2.3%. So it's quite a different environment in terms of costs. I'd be interested to see, is there any comparators we can make there? Why is it seem to be a less of an inflation increase in our community setting as opposed to hospitals?
I think it's much more complex than just prices across the board. When I started in pharmacy 25-30 years ago, it used to cost £500 million for a pharmaceutical company to bring a drug to market. Now, 25 years later, it costs £1.5 to £2 billion. And they have the same amount of time to recoup that research and development cost and make their margin. So costs have gone stratospherically high. Research is incredibly expensive. And in primary care, to answer your question, we're dealing with 85% generic prescribing. So it's easier for us to bring costs down in areas where medicines are no longer under patent. They're well understood, safety profiles understood. We can utilise them much more widely and much more effectively. And it's easier to get compliance, concordance, adherence and reduced ADRs, adverse drug reactions, because we're so familiar with these drugs. They've been out for 10, 15, 20 years. In the hospital service, they don't have that. They're dealing with branded product directly with pharma. They're innovating, and they've got these pharmas, rightly or wrongly, as you've described, have got these massive development costs to recoup. And the hospitals have to work with that, and it's been an exponential increase that's probably, it's ran away from inflation for obvious reasons, but that's what they're facing. And for me, that's the difference. We're not doing things particularly different. We have the same area drug and therapeutic committees, we have the same governance approach, the same robustness, the regular meetings, that, why are you prescribing there? Why is that GP practice got an anomalous spike there? We do the same things that the hospital do, and we manage costs that way, but we're dealing with a different animal than the specialist centres are.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Just a sup about hospital costs of meds. Anaesthetic drugs sometimes cost a lot more, and if we've got a faster throughput of patients through day surgeries or whatever, so isoflurane is a cheap anaesthetic drug, but it really makes people nauseous. And so then you have to give other meds in order to deal with that. But if we're using other drugs which are more expensive, like sevoflurane and desflurane, then patients can get up and get out pretty quick. But those drugs are more expensive. So would that be a contributing issue of why hospital medication costs a lot more? Because of our short ICU stays, but they're very intensive, or our total hip, total knee replacements, get them in, get them out. This is what's contributing to a higher cost as well.
Gil Caldwell.
So I think the example that you've given there is, I guess, a very specific example that describes how we consider the costs of a medicine within that overall pathway of care. Because I guess if we were to use that older, more side effect anaesthetic agent, then patients would spend longer in hospital. They, as you rightly say, they would need other supportive treatments. If we stay longer in hospital, there's increased risk of infection, etc., etc. So we need to look at our choice of medicine in the round, and that might be a good example where we may use a more expensive medicine because the overall benefits in terms of length of stay and patient harm and side effects are more positive with the newer, more expensive medicine than they are with the older one. So we would assess all of that as part of that pathway approach.
Report one of the worst complications is post-op nausea and vomiting.
Yep.
You know, they know they're going to have pain, so they don't complain about that. It's nobody told me I was going to be sick.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of energy by anaesthetists and is put into reducing those kind of complications, which increases medicine costs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I will go on to talk about patients' meds in the hospital. I know that for elective surgery, patients are told to bring their own medication and when they're admitted as well. And so then sometimes then they'll get prescribed other medication while they're in hospital, and then they're discharged with lots of meds and new meds, and sometimes that leads to duplication. And in one of our in the submissions it talked about a better transfer of information between the community and secondary care to reduce waste caused by this duplication. So what needs to be done to avoid unnecessary prescribing of medicines of patients on admission and then at discharge, and you know, what can be done to avoid this kind of duplication?
Gail Caldwell, then Jonathan.
Oh, okay, thank you. So patients' own medicines are a really important source of information. They tell us a lot about what patients are taking, and so we use them often when patients come into hospital, and we do encourage, in particular, as you describe in the elective setting, we do encourage patients to bring their medicines into hospital. And I think you raise an important point there, because if we were to duplicate that supply, then there is a risk. So we have a lot of systems within our hospitals across Scotland where we would encourage patients to bring in their own medicines. They're an important source of information. We might use them during the patient's stay if they seem of reasonable, if they're good quality, and we have assessment processes for that, and then the patient would take them home with them, and we might then just give them an antibiotic or a painkiller on discharge, and that helps with continuity of supply. It helps with familiarity for the patient, because what we don't want to do is give them the same drug, but it looks different, and then they think, is that a different drug? Are we to take that twice? So I think it is important that, especially in the elective setting, where we do encourage patients to bring in their own medicines, use them during the stay, and then supplement them with additional requirements going home, because I think that's a safer strategy.
Yeah, so in practice, a lot of this is what we would term medicines reconciliation. So basically just making sure that people have the right medicines with them, and when they move from one setting to another, for example, into hospital and then back out again into the community, that those medicines are reconciled, that those medicines are checked so that nothing is missed, nothing is duplicated, they don't end up taking something for a long period of time that should have been stopped quickly. And pharmacists and increasingly pharmacy technicians work really, really hard at meds rec, we would term it, and it soaks up a lot of resource. And again, this comes back to the interoperability of our systems, the lack of a universal sort of patient record means that we have to check things again and again and again, and patients are asked the same things again and again and again. We have done a lot of work, and again, some health boards are better progressed with this than others, around the discharge process and making sure that, especially where patients have complex mixes of medicines, and for example, if they maybe have a tray with their medicines that needs to be pre-prepared, and there's a lot of work around that there's good communication from our hospital colleagues out into the community pharmacy by email, or a lot of this used to be done by fax, but increasingly it's email. HEPMA's going to help with that. The more connected we are, the better, really. And again, some of our community teams will pick up the baton with a certain amount of that medicines reconciliation as well. It's a key task for our pharmacists working in GP practices, and that's been very, very helpful to shift some workload away from busy GPs, but again, we're all under pressure. And there's a certain amount of this workload really just shouldn't be there in the first place, because if we were all better connected, we wouldn't have to check things so many times, and we could be having more valuable patient conversations with patients about how they feel about their medicines and how they're actually taking them, rather than just being able to check in a very quick process whether we've just got in front of us what we're expecting and that nothing's changed.
Is HIPMA moving fast enough? I mean, if HIPMA is an electronic database that talks to people, talks to each other, that seems to be a great way of reducing waste and supporting conversations and communication. So is it moving fast enough forward?
The Scottish Government have fairly recently confirmed funding for boards to implement HIPMA across Scotland. As I said earlier, we've got a number of boards who've already implemented, and I am co-chair of the HIPMA Implementation Oversight Board, and we've given a commitment in the first quarter of this year to provide an update on implementation across the whole of NHS Scotland.
Okay, thank you very much. Gail Caldwell, you said in relation to patients bringing medicines into hospital that you would use them as long as they met a quality test. I think previously, in reply to the question around medicines being returned to the pharmacy or coming back in, you wouldn't consider them because you would assume the quality could not be verified. What's the difference?
So well spotted. I think when a patient brings medicines in from home, I guess we are giving that individual patient the same medicines that they've been using at home. So you're not asking me professionally to then give that medicine to another patient. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is we have very tight assessment processes to make sure that that medicine is in date, that it's been stored correctly, and we would talk to the patient, especially in that elective type situation. We would, in maybe a pre-admission clinic, we would sit down with the patient and we would review those medicines, and we would make sure they were in appropriate quality to continue for that individual patient that they've been dispensed for during their patient stay.
Okay, thank you very much. Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I've been following evidence this morning, so I'm interested. I'd like to ask about community pharmacists in particular, and this relates to costs as well. We all know that they are independent contractors to the NHS, and a large part of how they're remunerated is based on the recompense that they get for dispensing medicine. But it's also a fee, not just for a sort of markup on the product that they dispense, but for the actual action of dispensing in and of itself. I mean, it's arguable, and we got some of this back in the submissions we received, that this creates an incentive to dispense medicines, potentially at the expense of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And some submissions even called for a change in the contract to incentivise pharmacists by remunerating them for care such as medicine reviews and also deprescribing. Can I ask whether the panel believes that the current pharmacy contract has perverse incentives built within it for community pharmacists to dispense medicines and thereby create a barrier to them exploring non-prescription alternatives?
I would say that was perhaps the case a decade or so ago. I think we've been moving funding out of the drug tariff into our global sum and redistributing it for care, care packages and additional services. It's long recognised that reimbursement and remuneration through the tariff alone is just not a sustainable position to be in. 2006, we were only funded for dispensing. 15 years later, we're now funded for our acute medication service, the chronic medication service, we've got a public health service, and of course we've got the minor ailment service that's about to transition into Pharmacy First. So, it's been recognised that quality in and around interventions around supply is where we're going, and it makes better use of us as clinicians and pharmacists. It allows us to hopefully retain our own staff that we spend a lot of money training, and helps us to resist some of the transition into other areas that we've heard about workforce already by making the service more clinical. It's been a long, slow journey. As I say, 2006, we were reimbursed purely for dispensing. It was all we did. We are contractors. GPs are contractors. We recognised a long time ago that this position wasn't sustainable. Not only that, it didn't reflect our own skills and where we wanted to be in terms of the advice we give, in terms of the interventions we make. Outcomes were not great at recording, as we've talked about, but that's going to improve, and it's started to improve with the minor ailment service, which is it's been studied and is effectively the envy of the world, and it's going to be the envy of the world again, I think. So, yes, there's been a recognition, I agree. We've been mapping money away from the tariff and putting it into services for the last 15 years, and that process is continuing, and you probably will see that, and certainly the boards will see that in their drugs bill we've talked about already in the coming year or two. So I take your point, I accept it, but we have been changing, and we're miles away now from where we were.
And do you think the contract actually needs revision?
I think the contract is being revised. It's evolving. Achieving excellence is given as a pathway, a direction to follow, one that pretty much everybody actually agrees with, which is great. It's just the time it takes to deliver these services when you've got IT founding a big development in the minor ailment service, and you have a lot of unknown knowns in terms of how patients will react to it, how they will utilise it, and we've had to pilot all these things, and these things take time. And we've also got to develop a formulary, an evidence-based formulary, which we're in the process of doing, and it's just about ready, although nobody's seen it yet. But to make sure that the service is fully formed and evidence-based and gives value for money. So I think the perverse incentive to dispense was there. One of the things that was suggested 10 years ago was an incentive to deprescribe. I think that's part and parcel now of the MCR, the Medicines Care and Review Service, that will develop, although you'll not specifically be remunerated for deprescribing, but it'll be part of your behaviour as a clinician, and it's our future, because it's what the kids coming out of uni want to be doing.
So if I can just follow very quickly with a supplemental on that, that there's not anything sort of written down that says you'll be remunerated for deprescribing, but we all know, we've heard many times in this review, in this inquiry, that the benefits of deprescribing and reducing polypharmacy, particularly for older and infirm citizens who are actually being harmed in some cases by the range of medications they're on because nobody's reviewed it for a while. There's a saving attached to that. There's also a massive saving in terms of potential preventative work that stops people getting iller or makes their quality of life better. Is there a calculation we can do to incentivise it so that pharmacists can share in that saving, that they are they're incentivized to do it because they can identify the cost that they save, and they can maybe have just a small amount of that saving imparted back to them?
There absolutely, if there's the willingness in the civil service and their negotiators to go down that route. So absolutely, the technology's there, the information's there. Whether actually it would be subsumed into a bigger picture, because there are lots of elements to pharmaceutical care, and deprescribing is just one of them. I'm not so sure, but I would absolutely support something like that in recognition, and as an opposition to those that say we're incentivised to dispense, because that's professionally, it doesn't sit right with me. So.
Thank you for the question. I have a few concerns actually about the idea of remunerating people for deprescribing. I think the risks of incentivising deprescribing are the same as the risks we've just had in terms of suggesting that community pharmacists are dispensing because they're incentivised to dispense. And personally, I think we should move away from incentivising and having a neutral effect, and basically we should be rewarding high quality care. And I think that's where the contract has been going, and I have to endorse what Campbell is saying. It's changed dramatically in my lifetime as a director of pharmacy. So now community pharmacists are paid for professional professional fees and services. And I want to see, the only thing I would like to see is perhaps to move even further along that track so that we actually reward them for good practice. And it's not linked to whether it's a prescription or not. They will look to see what's best for the patient, and the patient will get what's best for them and not be incentivised to not prescribe. We know there are problems with polypharmacy, but the reality is frail elderly patients change very rapidly. They may not need a medicine at some stage, and very quickly they will need something again. I think it's actually about helping them to understand their medicines better as opposed to trying to incentivise deprescribing.
Jonathan Burton.
I mean, I've been a community pharmacist in Scotland for about 20 years now, and our contract has evolved. You could argue about the pace of that change, but it has been absolutely continuous. And the contract that we work with now is almost unrecognisable from that which I originally worked with in the year sort of 2000, 2001. There will always quite rightly be a lot of debate around the funding model for any contractor model-based profession. We're very similar to optometry, dentistry, and to general practice in that regard. And I think at RPS we have always argued for further transformational change in the community pharmacy contract to support pharmacists and their teams to really focus on the care that they deliver for patients. And to a certain extent, our contract has already partly moulded around that principle. And the argument around incentives for dispensing and the fact that we do still have part of our payment structure attached to the purchase and the reimbursement of medication, I think you can flip that on its head, and you need to look at, okay, are contractors and our pharmacy practices reimbursed effectively for the volume and the workload that they manage. Now, I think the missing bit of the jigsaw puzzle that we haven't quite got right yet is how do we ensure that when we're reimbursing for the supply of medicine, that the additional value is always there, because we're always talking to you guys about the additional value that we bring, the conversations with patients, the oversight, etc. And up to this point, because of lack of IT and just the way that the contract has developed over time, it's actually been quite difficult to prove that, to quantify it, to record it. But I think we're getting closer and closer to the point where we can actually build a really good evidence base and make sure that there's good visibility over the great work that goes on around all those dispensings, and actually to incentivize pharmacists to absolutely engage with that and be absolutely consistent around it, because that's what the public deserve. They deserve their medicine and all the additional benefits of getting those from part of our community pharmacy network. But there needs to be, the contract does need to compensate for sheer workload, for sheer numbers of patients seen, but we need to be better at ensuring the quality around that. I think it's about the visibility of the quality that we offer as professionals, and that for me is like the next evolutionary step in our contract. A lot of stuff is lined up for that, and that will be the next step. And actually, with the development of the Pharmacy First service, that's going to see a lot more visibility over the consultation model and what we can bring to that. So there's no reason, in theory, why we can't replicate some of that into our dispensing services as well.
Brian Whittle.
If I could discuss sort of chronic medication services, I know that it's intended to obviously help people with long-term chronic conditions, but it's come under a little bit of criticism around the idea that it increases unnecessary repeat prescribing. So, I mean, I think it's just that question really to the panel. Does the chronic medication service exacerbate that unnecessary repeat prescribing?
If it shouldn't, is the short answer, because it's designed to rationalise and optimise a patient's therapy. So it's about building conversations with your patient. So you don't just layer and layer and layer medicines without having those conversations and ensuring there's absolutely a need for them and the patient's utilising them properly. So chronic medication service shouldn't increase medicines use. It should stabilise it, if anything. We're not making the clinical decisions, the prescribing decisions, so we're not actually driving medicines, but we are there as experts in medicines to question some of the prescribing. But in practice, I would be inclined to say from my own practice that actually we probably see less prescribing with CMS than we do with any other form of acute prescribing.
Yeah, and building on what Campbell said in the move towards medicines care and review and serial prescribing, that, as I said earlier, that's specifically designed to encourage that conversation with the patient at the point of dispensing, to ensure that there isn't additional waste or additional supply when that's not required by the patient. So I think that will continue to build on CMS to encourage reduction in waste and more effective systems.
If I could just segue a little bit, using that example there, Dave Stewart talked about it and Alex Hamilton touched on it. I think, are we in a situation where the default position is to medicate when perhaps other alternatives might be helpful but are unavailable to, in general, in the medical profession, unavailable to them, so we just medicate?
Yeah, I agree with your point, and I know the committee are going to explore the issues of social prescribing, and I would come back perhaps to the example, and I know the committee's heard some examples around diabetes and smoking cessation, but come back to that example around COPD and where the most cost-effective interventions are. And if you're a prescriber, a GP, a clinician in a consultation with a patient, and you don't have, let's use the example of access to good pulmonary rehab services for someone with COPD, your default position is going to be to reach for your prescribing and write a prescription for a medicine. So we need to ensure that medicines are placed in that overall pathway of care, so that we know, as I say from the COPD example, that the most cost-effective thing to do is give patients flu jabs, then smoking cessation, and it's that sense of what are the choices that the GP has when he's thinking about managing that condition. And I think you're right, there is a tendency towards writing a prescription when there are no other alternatives available.
Okay, thank you very much. David Stewart.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can I ask the panel what assessment they've made of the effectiveness of the minor ailment scheme?
Campbell Shumans, I think you mentioned it.
Yes,
as an important part of the picture.
It's been a huge part of the picture, and to that end, Community Pharmacy Scotland commissioned some research with 2 universities, an independent researcher, to assess the impact and the value nationally of the minor ailment scheme, and the outcomes were overwhelmingly positive, and we'd be happy to share that research with you. I can't speak to it just now because I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, we've done that. It's loved by patients overwhelmingly, as I've said. Plus, independently, the Scottish Government in piloting the expansion of the service and the upskilling, if you like, of the service in Ayrshire and Arran have also done their own research that show similar outcomes, although their angles are slightly different, and I'm sure that will be shared also.
And if I understand it correctly, eligibility has been now extended to every patient.
Yes.
Do you feel, and it may be in the research, do you feel that generally across Scotland patients understand the scheme? It certainly seems a very sensible and important scheme, but is it understood enough, and is enough patients registering for it?
I think it could be better understood. I think it's those that utilise it absolutely understand it, and those that manage it absolutely understand it, and those that perform it absolutely understand it. But in terms of the national picture, understandably, it wasn't heavily publicised, and I think there needs to be a strategy in place for this development, and a reinfusion of that publicity around what the service is. But it's loved by those that use it. You have slight anxiety about over publicity and the wrong kind of publicity, but frankly, Scotland's managed this really well, and I'm sure they will. I'm not part of the promotions team for the launch of the new service, but I imagine they'll get the message spot on. But it does need reinvigorated.
Yeah, I think community pharmacies in Scotland are perfectly and uniquely placed to support the assessment and management of common clinical conditions. And I think your point is an important one, that we need to do more to educate the public and to signpost the public and to change the direction of travel of the public when they're seeking help for common clinical conditions. And some of our front doors of our hospitals and our out of hours become quite busy at times. And I think we need to look at how many of the common clinical conditions being presented through some of these front doors of our hospitals and services could be safely and effectively managed through minor ailments and pharmacy first, and we need to build on that. But you're right, we need to help the public to make different choices, and we need to signpost them better to go to the community pharmacy, especially community pharmacies who offer extended hours, you know, that are open Saturdays, Sundays, late nights. It's these pharmacies that we need to encourage the patients to go to rather than go to out of hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to recognise that there's been some independent research around minor ailments service, and it's generally been very, very well received by the Scottish public, and we're about to go through the next evolution of that service as it merges into Pharmacy First, and currently Pharmacy First is an additional tranche of walk-in service where patients can access assessment, treatment and referral for a slightly extended range of conditions. And indeed we do have some, albeit smaller, pieces of research around some of the early Pharmacy First work which effectively just showed exactly the same outcomes and opinions from the public and other professionals, i.e. it's been positively received. And then there's a smaller cohort of pharmacists, which includes myself, who have been through a slightly extended clinical skills pathway, who are independent prescribers, who are again dealing with another layer of the onion on top of that in terms of walk-in conditions, and that's being further rolled out across Scotland. I agree. I mean, I fully endorse and support, and I'm living and breathing proof of sort of, you know, Pharmacy First and how that works. It's a big part of my daily life. And I think the public education around this is really key. And I think it's important that we stress that Pharmacy First is not pharmacy absolutely first. Absolutely first is knowing how to look after yourself for basic conditions, having some medicines in your medicine cabinet. Pharmacy First is about your first point of contact more formally with our health service, rather than jumping straight into a GP practice or an out-of-hours centre, or even an A&E attendance. And I think it's important that we frame it in that regard. I'm really excited about the next steps for Pharmacy First, but just a cautionary note as well. There is the risk here that we will be absolutely swamped with work, and this is why the context is so important, and we do need to still keep a certain amount of focus on teaching people early in their adult lives, and actually as children, some of the principles of self-care, working on that through schools, and making sure that people are not accessing service for everything all the time, because we just don't have the capacity for that. We need to be seeing the right patients at the right time, and able to signpost them as well. And also, with the latest iteration of the service being opened up to the whole population, that brings with it a great responsibility on our shoulders to make sure that we are offering that service in an appropriate way and signposting adequately. And part of that is being joined up IT-wise, and that is really, really important. We will only be able to max out the benefit of this if we are properly plugged in to out of hours, if we are properly plugged into our GP colleagues.
Just reiterating some things, you're asking about evaluation. So we talked about the fact there's an evaluation from 2 schools of pharmacy. We also did a small evaluation in our own health board with the new Pharmacy First service with impetigo and UTIs. So of 1,000 consultations, 90% of those were handled within the community pharmacy. They could deal with the patients. A couple of them were urgent and required referral to out-of-hours services, and a few could go and see the general practitioner the next day. So we have clear evidence that this works.
briefly.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think certainly on a naive level, it's a lot punchier title. I don't know who's responsible for advertising the scheme, but on the serious point, certainly in previous evidence we've taken is that in those in lower socio-economic groups, sometimes don't approach primary care in a way that we would want. Hopefully then this new service will allow more difficult reach patients to access pharmacy first in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm interested in some issues around online pharmacies. I'm just looking here at Pharmacy to You, which is one of the most important, but it's also got online doctors as well that can prescribe. And I'm interested to know whether you think that distance dispensing, whether it poses a threat to community pharmacy and good pharmaceutical care, because my issue is where's the face-to-face in that, and how are we regulating it? And I know that the service is regulated by the Care Quality Commission, and the UK-based doctors are GMC registered, but if a doctor's prescribing antibiotics, doesn't a set of vital signs have to be done first on the patient to know, you know, what is their baseline assessment? So I'm wondering what you think about distance dispensing and whether it poses a threat.
Campbell Simmons.
I think England's gone down a very different route from Scotland, where health has obviously devolved, and Scotland's direction of travel is about face-to-face consultation in the local communities and accessibility where and whenever is possible. Online offerings are absolutely appropriate, and it's a fact of life, and it's a direction of travel, but you have to be able to offer a whole package, I think. So in Scotland, you have to be able to offer the public health service, you have to be able to offer pharmacy first, you have to be able to offer serial dispensing, serial prescribing, medicines care and review. And a lot of these things, while are not impossible to reflect in an online offering, and maybe technology one day will get there, at the moment it's about the bricks and mortar in those communities. And I would say, yeah, there's a threat, but all competition is healthy in some respects. However, our direction of travel is much more about the practitioner, the clinician in your community, and face-to-face consultation. So. Some
of the face-to-face could be done digitally, because we've already got Attend Anywhere and those types of online engagements that way. And the serial dispensing or online could also be about catheters, colostomy products. And last week I mentioned that medicines are not just about like the tablets, it's also about other repeat prescriptions like testing strips for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and as well as colostomy and catheters and things like that was mentioned last week. But I mean, it's a concern that yes, you can just have your repeat prescriptions, but the face-to-face is a continued way of assessing patients' adherence as well to the medicines.
Adherence, concordance, you know, knowing the patient, patient's history, taking the patient's holistic view of the patient is extremely important. And, you know, these are things that you don't get online. And I think patients at the moment have choices and do tend to vote with their feet, but the way the service is constructed as well, it's about the whole service rather than, you know, taking bits of it and we can zap our prescription over there and it comes through the post, but then you lose that intervention opportunity locally as well. So yeah, there's risks and dangers, but that's not the direction of travel in Scotland.
Angela.
So the points you raise are important, and we as Directors of Pharmacy met recently with the General Pharmaceutical Council to talk about online pharmacies and how they regulate them. They've raised their concerns with us. It's not a particular issue in Scotland at the present time. You've talked about some of the medicines that people could get that might be helpful, but what they're saying is people are tending to go trying to get opiates, trying to get antibiotics, trying to get lifestyle drugs. So there are risks and issues, and we are working closely with the GPHC around that in Scotland. Healthcare Improvement Scotland have also got a responsibility around the regulation as well. And so we as Directors of Pharmacy meet with them to look at how we are hopefully keeping the system safe within Scotland.
Jonathan Burton.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the points that Campbell was raising about how our contract has evolved in Scotland and the way it supports our pharmacy network, our pharmacies in our communities, and I think, You know, when you talk about online services and the potential impact that could have on the sort of the greater sort of pharmaceutical service across Scotland, I think you need to take a step back. You need to think about, okay, what are our community pharmacies actually there for? Okay, they're there to supply medicines, and you can supply medicines through an online model. Of course, you can do that. But our pharmacies are an integral part of our communities. You know, the banks have gone, some of the post offices have gone, the pharmacies are still there. If a patient who doesn't have a car, who's maybe not IT literate, maybe has young family, needs help there and then, they can get that. They can walk down the street and they can go to their pharmacy and they can speak to a health professional. And that's what we're supporting in Scotland. We've actively made a choice to support that model. And we have a lot of small pharmacies in remote and rural areas. We have a lot of pharmacies in places where other businesses are not, in deprived areas and inner city areas. You know, we are part of the social fabric of those communities, and I think we need to sort of really cherish that and look after that. And I think there is genuine social value to that, and there are some really key advantages. And I do agree as well, you know, our regulator has started to be a lot more bullish. And okay, we've got CQC, we've got GMC registering the regulating the doctors, but we have GPHC who have a certain amount of responsibility, obviously, for regulating the pharmacy and the pharmacist and technician input into these online services. And you know, they have really started to have a good dig around this, and what they're finding is not pretty. You know, it's not to do with supporting communities. It's not to do with supporting patients a lot of the time. It's about selling medicines for, quite frankly, the wrong reasons.
Yeah, just the point about opiates and opiate prescribing has, I think, been brought up previously in England because there was overprescribing of opiates with the potential implication that it was intended then for further sale for others. So I suppose the way to proceed with this is to make sure that there are built-in safeties or capping of certain, if it is an opiate that you're going to use, well, it is intended for you, even if it might be a higher dose.
It's important to have checks and balances in the system. So apart from the work that we all do as directors of pharmacy, looking at prescribing as a whole, many of us are also the accountable officer for controlled drugs for our health boards. And so we have a separate team who actually look at the prescribing of controlled drugs, and that's not just for NHS prescribing. We will look at non-NHS prescribing and private prescribing as well, and just trying to get a sense of what's happening. Look at, and we will go and meet with prescribers if we've got concerns about their prescribing habits.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and can I thank the witnesses. It's been a very full session. Apologies to members who weren't able to get late supplementaries into the picture, but I'm sure we will hear more from, I know one or two commitments have already been made by the witnesses in relation to research and other papers that you're able to supply, as we look forward to seeing those. Thank you very much. We'll now suspend for a couple of minutes and then resume in private session in 2 minutes' time.